This next question's for Ajit. It comes from Professor Don Wunsch at the Missouri University of Science and Technology, who says, Mr. Jain, what has COVID-19 taught us about systemic and correlated risk, and is there anything that we will do differently from now on?
Yeah, in the insurance business, we often think about pandemic risk as one of the risk factors that we need to cope with in our business. Having said that, I think the big lesson for us, having gone through what we've gone through recently, is that while we were aware of the fact that pandemic risk is a risk factor, it was totally underpriced by all of us in the industry. Several of us thought it's an event that will happen at most once in 100 years, and even then, those odds are pretty high. So I think the big lesson for us is to recalibrate and rethink about what the return time is for something like a pandemic risk. And separately, we haven't yet done a good enough job as an industry, I'm saying, in terms of correlating the risk and aggregating the risk and making sure we can deal with the aggregate numbers. For example, pandemic risk has obviously taken people's lives, but then separately a bunch of us used to write something called event cancellation or contingency policies. And in terms of pricing for the contingency policies, like the Olympics being canceled, NBC would buy insurance for their rights, which might suddenly be not worth much. And when pricing something like that, we would think in terms of earthquake and risk and more recently terrorism, but we would never factor something like what portion of the price should come from the pandemic exposure. So I think the industry will become a lot more sophisticated in terms of thinking through what is the impact of pandemic risks across the entire portfolio, as opposed to it just being localized to one or two areas.
And I'm sorry, Don asked if anyone else on the stage wanted to comment after Ajit on that same topic.
I missed that.
Oh, he was just looking if anyone else on the stage wanted to comment on that.
Well, as Ajit mentioned, people were throwing in an event cancellation. I mean, lots of people buy insurance against the Olympics being canceled or the United States not participating. I mean, they try to think of all kinds of risks because they have ad campaigns based upon all. So there's a lot of event cancellation insurance, and it was probably underpriced the implicit part of that premium that was attributable to a pandemic risk. I mean, Bill Gates gave a terrific talk at TED 5 or 6 years ago, and people ignored it. And it's very interesting because this isn't a worst case what we've seen, and yet it's staggering in terms of what has happened, and people that wrote insurance that they may have found out sometimes that they were covering things they didn't even intend to cover, and maybe the insurance didn't think they were buying, but nevertheless, after the event occurs, that they get very inventive in coming after them. There are certain risks too that are just too big. The nuclear risk, for example, I mean, the federal government is very early on, they recognized that the private insurance industry, they can't handle the risk involved in the financial risk that would be involved in terms of a massive nuclear strike or something like that. So it's the pandemics. The wording will be much more careful in future policies on trying to define it very precisely. And incidentally, I mean, in the way the cases have come so far, in the United Kingdom, and I think there was one particular insurer. I mean, the cases are coming down much tougher on insurers in the United States. I mean, the policies were just written differently. You don't get insurance against something you don't buy against for, and generally the court decisions have come down favorable to insurers, and at Berkshire it just so happens we are not a big player, but that's in commercial multiple peril, which might be where it is not a huge factor for Berkshire.
This follow-up question is from Martin Devine, and he asked both Ajit and Warren, what's your best estimate of Berkshire's insurance claim exposure from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, in terms of reserves, starting from last year to the end of the first quarter this year, we have put up $1.6 billion and change in terms of reserves. Now, what that doesn't take into account is some of the frequency benefit because of COVID-19 that results because of fewer accidents. And Geico has had a huge tailwind because of that. But in terms of what the insurance operations collectively are going to be writing checks for, that number, as of now, is about $1.6 billion. And my guess is that will probably grow. Because if you look upon it, the industry as a whole has reserved, we've reserved 1.6, as I mentioned. The industry as a whole has reserved about $25 to $30 billion for COVID-19 as of now. If you believe the pundits in the industry, they will tell you that number is probably going to be closer to $100 billion. So there's another about $75 billion of COVID-19 losses that need to flow through insurance industry's balance sheet and income statement. Our number, therefore, of 1.6 that we have as of now is going to be a lot higher, but it's not something that we cannot manage completely.
Yeah, we will not be in the top 5
Right.
payers of, my guess, of insurance claims, even though we're, we write a much smaller amount of both life insurance and annuities, actually. And, you know, in the end, we had more life insurance claims, but the annuities are not going to last. More people will have died that would have otherwise got payments under annuities. It cuts a lot of ways. It's a, you know, one of the great human catastrophes of all time, but it is not, it's not that big an insurance. And I would say this, if the insurance industry thinks they're going to lose $100 billion, the $100 billion ought to be up on their books now. I mean, the idea of feeding in losses, you've got a liability, and our goal is not, our goal is to put up the liability when we think it's happened. And then if we should not be at $1.6 billion, I would say this: if we really think we're going to have some proportional share of $100 billion, well, that's enough said on that.